And so how can the Arizona Cardinals look at the Philadelphia Eagles, look at the way that their roster is constructed, and learn from them? Should always look at the way championship teams are built and try to at least emulate them in some way. How did they get there? There should always be that thought exercise across sports. How did the Eagles get to the Super Bowl? Why did they win the Super Bowl? How did they do that? And what processes can we put in place, do we already have in place, for us to follow that model? It still be our model, right? Be the Cardinal model, the way we want things to work. But learn. See how other teams are put together. Well, it does help that the Cardinals have somebody that was on Nick Sirianni's staff the last time they were in the Super Bowl, running things for them in Jonathan Gannon. So you have at least that little footprint there. But there's a really easy way to emulate a Super Bowl team. You could just take their players. You could just sign the guys that were on that team in the Super Bowl and bring them to your team, because a bunch of the guys that were making the plays on the defensive side of the ball are going to be free agents in a couple of weeks. Josh Sweat, going to be a free agent. Zach Bond, going to be a free agent. Milton Williams, the interior of that defense, going to be a free agent. Those three guys, Sweat, Bond, Williams, all over the place. Bond had an interception. Sweat with a bunch of sacks. Milton Williams was causing pressures on the interior. I think he had a couple sacks as well. They were all over the place. And it kind of fits. What do the Cardinals need? A lot of help up front. A lot of help getting after the quarterback. Why not? In the Super Bowl, young players, why not take the guys that were just on a Super Bowl winning team? That's easy, right? Just takes dollars. But is that the right way to do things? And I don't mean morally the right way to do things. I mean, is that the best use of your assets? Is that the best use of what this offseason opportunity is for the Arizona Cardinals? I have a very strong belief that across sports, free agency is a complementary resource. It cannot be the main driver of how you build your team. Look at that team that played on the field yesterday for the Philadelphia Eagles. And I know they have their fair share of guys that they traded for. They traded for A.J. Brown. That's a big piece to have acquired via a trade. I get it. They signed Saquon Barkley. They signed Nick Bond. They signed those guys. But you know what else they did? They drafted and developed Jalen Hurts. They drafted and developed a good portion of that offensive line. Devonta Smith drafted and developed. Carter, Nolan Smith on the defense, draft picks that were developed. Quinyon Mitchell, Cooper DeJean, draft picks that were developed. You have your A.J. Browns. You have your Saquon Barkleys. You have your complementary pieces via trades, via free agency. But remember, Saquon Barkley is a one-of-one running back. A.J. Brown is an upper echelon elite wide receiver. When those players become available, yeah, you explore those. Yeah, you make those adds to your team. But they signed Saquon Barkley as a complementary piece to put them over the top. Now, he was more than a complementary piece, but that was the idea, that he didn't have to be everything. He ended up being everything for them offensively, but he didn't have to be. They brought in A.J. Brown because they wanted another threat on the outside, but they had Devonta Smith. He didn't have to be the only guy producing for this offense. They had Dallas Goedert. He was a complementary piece. Now, he's a pretty good one. He's the number one wide receiver, opens up a lot of doors for everybody else. Free agency is complementary. Of the top 10 teams that spent last offseason, I ran these numbers this morning. Last offseason, the top 10 teams in free agency spend, total dollars allocated in free agency. Only 4 of the top 10 made the playoffs. 40%. Only 40% of the top 10 teams that spent the most money last offseason made the playoffs. The top 3 teams, meaning the 3 teams that spent the most last offseason in free agency, all 3 of those teams missed the playoffs. The Philadelphia Eagles were 11th in total spend during last offseason in free agency, and that included signing Saquon Barkley. They were 11th. The Cardinals were one of those teams in the top 10. The Cardinals were 9th in free agency spend last year. Yet, the Eagles didn't spend like a top 10 team. They draft and develop. So if you want to add Sweat as a complementary piece while also drafting and developing players of your own, if you want to sign Milton Williams for your interior while also developing Darius Robinson, I'm all for that. But you can't spend your way to success. You can't get all 3 of those guys who I ran the numbers using Spotrack's market value. They have Sweat at 18.8 million AAV, Bond at around 9-10, and Williams at 12. That's $40 million you wanted to spend on all 3 of those guys. That would basically be a large chunk of your budget. That's not how you do this. You might sign one of those guys. You might sign Milton Williams. You might attack Sweat in free agency. We've talked about that link. Makes a ton of sense. Would be on board with it. That would be one of the free agent pass rushers that I could get excited about. But you don't pour all your resources into the free agency bucket. You're not going to spend your way out of the roster inefficiencies that this team has right now. It's going to be a complementary piece. It's why I keep saying you can sign Josh Sweat, but you better draft somebody. You better also sign another guy in a lower tier bucket, maybe take a flyer on somebody that you can get more out of them. You can't throw all your eggs into the top end of the market. You can't throw all your eggs into free agency. It is a complementary asset. The Eagles did not spend their way to a Super Bowl. Now, they paid Jalen Hurts. They paid those guys. They paid Saquon Barkley. But they paid Saquon Barkley when they thought their window was at its peak. They didn't sign Saquon Barkley when they're an up-and-coming franchise. They had already been to a Super Bowl. They had already failed in a Super Bowl. They were trying to piece their roster together. They were watching Jason Kelce walk out the door, replacing him. They were watching changing a lot of their defense out with the younger players that they had spent years drafting and developing, like Carter, like Smith, their recent picks in Mitchell and DeJean. Those guys that all made plays in the game, Cooper DeJean had a pick 6. It was a draft pick. Jalen Hurts, Super Bowl MVP, a second-round draft pick. Devonta Smith making plays, a first-round draft pick. The guys that were making plays in that game yesterday, not all of them via the free agency bucket. So yes, free agency is a tool. Yes, free agency is something that the Cardinals should use to improve their roster. Agreed 100%. And they improved their roster last year by using free agency. But it can't be the be-all, end-all. What gets you over the top, what allows you to climb the mountaintop of the NFL, is you have to be able to draft and develop. You have to hit on those day 2 picks. You have to hit every once in a while on some day 3 picks. You have to be able to draft guys and develop them. Instead of asking questions at the end of the year about a disappointing rookie campaign for Marvin Harrison Jr., I'd like to have conversations about how good Cooper DeJean was. That's how I'd like to talk about the Cardinals, the hits that they have, not the up-in-the-air nature of their draft picks. That's where we talk about the development start. The development stuff has to come next. So there's an easy way to do this. And I guarantee you those guys are going to get paid. Remember the Patriots a couple years ago and all the money they spent in free agency? What did it get them? The top 3 teams that spent money last offseason, all 3 of them, the top 3, all 3 missed the playoffs. The Super Bowl champs spent the 11th most in free agency last year. So towards the higher end, but not in the top 10. And only 40% of the top 10 made the playoffs. So think about that next time you want the Cardinals to just spend all over the place. And I know I want this team to sign T. Higgins. I want this team to potentially sign Josh Sweat. but it is not the cure-all. It is not an immediate quick fix. It does not guarantee anything. It can, and those moves can have an impact if you do all of the other work, the drafting and the developing.